Hello, everybody. My name is Robert Gregory. I'm CEO of the Australian Jewish Association. Welcome to everyone who's joining us live on Zoom, live on Facebook, listening to the recording on JA Community Radio, or watching on YouTube. Reminder to everyone, if you have a question, put your hands up with the React button, and we'll get to some questions in the second half of the night. Please, when we get to that, do keep your questions short, and we may skip some old timers to go to some new people. Now, tonight we have a very special Zoom session. In recent years, anti-Semitism has surged on the left, while many on the right have been very strong supporters of Israel and of the Jewish people. But there's a new and concerning trend emerging. A fringe on the political right is turning against Israel, and in some cases, against Jews themselves. Our guest tonight, David Leyonhjelm, is a former senator for the Liberal Democratic Party and Australia's first ever elected Libertarian parliamentarian. So we're in for quite an interesting Zoom tonight. Just before we start, we're going to go to former AJ president, Dr. David Adler, who will just share a couple of words.
Thank you, Robert. And I wanted to give a bit of background concerning our guest, David Leyonhjelm. I first came across David when he was relatively new senator for New South Wales. And I recall meeting him in his office, and he made a couple of strong impressions. One was that he came across as quite an intelligent person, which is always good, but also that he was accomplished in other things before entering politics. He has a number of degrees. He'd been involved in veterinary medicine and associated industry and a couple of other things, and actually has quite a formidable CV. And that's different to a lot of people we see in politics who've sort of come up through party ranks or union ranks or whatever. In other words, he's had real world experience. I didn't know much about libertarians, but we knew that they were interested in small government and were opposed to government waste. So when we discussed with David the foreign aid that was being misused to the Palestinian Authority and to UNRWA, this is something that he latched onto, I guess because it fitted well with his political worldview. And there are a number of very good sessions that were conducted at Senate estimates. And afterwards, if you're interested in seeing, we do have some legendary video clips of David together with then Senator Eric Abetz sort of playing tag team in bringing DFAT to account. It actually had a positive effect when the coalition was the government and helped to achieve some really important reforms in reducing the funding to UNRWA and eliminating the cash to the Palestinian Authority, some of which has now been reversed. So that's all I wanted to say by way of background. He is the sort of person that we like to see in Parliament, someone who brings real-world experience and has values. But back to you, Robert, to conduct the session.
Thank you, David. So to start, let's look at this term. I know you've got some thoughts about it. The woke right. What does it mean to you? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's an attempt to use the woke term, which we recognise when it's applied to the left, to the right. When we look at the woke left, what do we see? Is identity politics, victimhood. So everybody's got to be a victim of some kind. They find racists under the bed, or they're concerned about sexuality. Transsexuals are a major issue to the woke left. Gender identity in general, so the patriarchy, and oppression. You know, there's always somebody got to be oppressed. And also included in that, increasingly in the woke left, is anti-Semitism. It will sometimes be disguised as anti-Zionism. But I guess you've probably had this debate a million times. I don't think that's a legitimate argument. You scratch an anti-Zionist and you'll find an anti-Semite just below the surface. And so, you know, it's a broad term, but you can recognize it on the left. When you try to apply it to the right, it's not easy, and I'm not sure that it can be adequately applied. There are people on the right who will argue in favor of identity. They will claim victimhood of various kinds. They tend to be relatively vocal on the racist issue, although it's anti-white. Well, they're opposed to anti-white racism. And they are quite commonly opposed to support for Ukraine in its war with Russia. I don't quite see why the term woke applies, but there are people who fall into that category. And increasingly, as you suggested, or perhaps not increasingly, but anyway, present, is an anti-Israel, anti-Semitic element to it. Again, they often will try to distinguish between anti-Israel and anti-Jewish. Usually that position is wafer thin. I don't think it stands up to scrutiny. But there are people who sort of, broadly speaking, can be classified along those lines. I'm dubious whether the word woke can be applied to them. They are on the right, but they don't fit the pattern of the typical right side of politics. They have different views at least on some issues, and whether that makes them woke or not, I think, you know, arguably not.
So, turning to foreign affairs, before the latest little war between Iran and Israel, we saw some people on the right, particularly in America, warning that it would be a World War III, that America would get dragged into a big war. And obviously, everyone saw the results. It was an attack. It ended quickly. It was as many of the pro-Israel people had predicted. Now, we didn't see apologies from the likes of Tucker Carlson and the people that predicted that their predictions were wrong. So I wanted to ask, is there a compromise between the interventionism that we saw under George Bush type people and the isolationism being pushed now by a lot of people on the right? Is there a middle ground that we should be reaching for when it comes to foreign affairs?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, isolationism has always had very deep roots in America. America had to be dragged kicking and screaming into the First World War. It was highly isolationist in right up to 1918, I think it was, when America joined the First World War. Similar thing happened in the Second World War. Wasn't until Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and then Germany declared war on America that America entered the war. Churchill had been attempting to get America to join in and help them out for almost 2 years, I think, unsuccessfully, because the isolationism was just running so deeply. That isolationism is still there, and it is a major influence on attitudes towards helping Ukraine, towards helping Israel, towards getting involved in any international conflict. There are a couple of arguments that underpin that attitude. One is cost. So the libertarian argument is you shouldn't spend taxpayers' money on foreign conflicts that don't directly affect your own interests. I understand that argument. The question, of course, is where do your own interests start and finish? America has been, ever since at least the Second World War, the world's policeman, and has done a great job of doing that as well. There's a very good argument for saying that what it's done at its own expense has been in its own interests. You can look at the Marshall Plan, for example, after the Second World War. America benefited that in the long run because Europe recovered economically and became a major trading partner with America, and so America benefited from that trade. And that's an oversimplification, obviously, but there's plenty more along those lines. The other source of isolationism is just, was it Washington who said we should be friends with everybody, trade with everybody, but have no tangling alliances? That's often cited as a source of isolationism, and it's based on the fact that at the time it was said in the late 1700s, early 1800s, Lincoln also repeated it, and others. There were innumerable conflicts in Europe. The Europeans were always fighting with each other, and there was a natural tendency for the Americans to look at that and say, well, that's not our business. Many of the people who'd come to America and settled in America came from Europe and had it deliberately to escape the kind of politics and conflicts and restrictions, and they had royal families. They weren't democracies in most cases, and the settlers who'd left those countries and come to America didn't want to have a bar of anything going on in their old countries. So there was a natural tendency at that time to want to stay away from it, and that's what became isolationism. I think the people who are isolationists these days have forgotten those origins. They don't seem to realise that those arguments don't stand up very well, that it's a smaller world these days. You can't just say something on the other side of the world is not relevant to you. It may well be extremely relevant to you. But it's a strong influence still in American politics. It's on the other side of the world. It's not our business. We shouldn't spend any money on it, and let them fight amongst themselves. Now there are times, of course, when letting them fight amongst themselves is probably the best policy. I remember when Iraq and Iran were fighting with each other, the smart thing to do was leave them alone and let them kill each other. But you can't say that just because it's on the other side of the world, it doesn't affect you. I think it's an incorrect approach to have. Each situation has to be taken on its merits. And there are certainly situations where something on the other side of the world matters to lots of other people on the other far away. The Israel-Gaza conflict is a good example. It's highly relevant to America. It's highly relevant to Australia, for that matter. Ukraine-Russia conflict is highly relevant to both countries as well. But in America, the Tucker Carlson type people, they're still locked in that old isolationist thinking. I also suspect that there is an element of anti-Semitism, old style, Christian-based anti-Semitism. You'll be aware that Europe, from Russia on the east right through to countries in Western Europe, had hundreds of pogroms in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. And what they mostly were conducted by Christians. These days, we associate anti-Jewish barbarism with Muslims, rightfully so. Christians have stopped killing Jews at least. But the underlying attitudes had never totally gone away. I don't profess to fully understand it myself, but it's always been there. There's long been an element of anti-Semitism within Christianity, which pops up every now and again. And people like Tucker Carlson and Candace, what's her name? Candace Owens. They profess to be overt Christians. I would be surprised if there isn't, that old style anti-Semitism influencing their thoughts. And they're the ones who for some reason or other, get labeled with this woke right description.
I think it's interesting. You briefly mentioned Churchill. There's been a lot of attacks on his legacy, and I think that's maybe where part of the term woke right comes from. These people who want to blame the West for the world's ills the same way the left woke does, and who are trying to attack historical figures, great historical figures like that. I think maybe that could have something to do with it. But turning now to a question about the libertarian movement, we've seen in Argentina, Javier Milei, who represents a very philo-Semitic, pro-Israel, pro-Jewish libertarian view. And then we see in America, maybe best represented by Dave Smith, the comedian, who's been quite vocally anti-Israel. So we see there's a battle in the movement. Could you maybe speak to where you think it's going, what's going on, if it's occurring in Australia as well, and what we should look out for?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. So in libertarianism, you don't judge a person by anything other than what they do. So for those libertarians who are making judgments about people based on who they are, that's not libertarian. Having said that, libertarians are notorious for their exceptions. I encountered that when I was in Parliament. People would come up to me quite often and say, I'm a libertarian, except for, or but for, and then they would cite something that proved they weren't libertarian at all. They just were inclined to agree with me on a few issues. And I think that's what's going on here. Milei in Argentina is a genuine libertarian, as far as I can tell. He's certainly economically, and I can't see any social policy exceptions. Having said that, I don't know all of his policies on everything. But in the libertarian world, there is still this isolationist element, and we see that in Australia. In the Libertarian Party, which I'm still a member of in Australia, we have some people who think that the conflict in Ukraine, the conflict in Israel have nothing to do with Australia, and therefore taxpayers should spend no money on it. Now that is interesting because, of course, Australia doesn't spend practically anything on either of those conflicts now, but you will hear some people who profess to be libertarians in Australia arguing, even having a view on it, expressing an opinion, taking a side, standing up for one or other of Israel or Ukraine is not allowable under their values. I profoundly disagree with that. I think values matter. Values matter to libertarians as much as anybody else. And if those values are under attack, a libertarian would argue, well, it's none of our business to come to the aid of those under attack unless it's within our country. Now, I would argue that libertarian values, defensive libertarian values, doesn't end at a border. Just because there is a national border doesn't mean that you don't have an interest on the other side of it. That's a major source of conflict in the libertarian world. It occurs in America just as much as it does here. The Libertarian Party in America is profoundly isolationist. I'm not sure that it's because of the no entangling alliances thing. I think it's because they're just opposed to the spending of money on a conflict that's outside America's borders. I think it's bizarre, and if I was in America, I would not be calling myself a libertarian. But there it is. It's the situation. We do have those sort of factions within Australia. We have the isolationist faction and the non-isolationist faction within the Libertarian Party in Australia, although they're not at each other's throats like they are in America.
Now, turning to the recent hate speech laws, which we've seen introduced in various states, New South Wales, Victoria, federally, AJA was the only Jewish organization to raise some concerns. We weren't completely on board with some of the restrictions. So do you want to maybe comment about what's happened, your thoughts about these restrictions on speech, and maybe more broadly about also how the government, whether federal, state, whatever you want, how they've handled the anti-Semitism situation?
Mm. So the governments are struggling to get their heads clear about what they're trying to prevent. Are they trying to prevent ideas they don't like, and views they don't like, or they're trying to prevent harm to other people? And they've been quite muddled about this for quite a long time. If you take the old view, sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never harm me, what the government is doing with its hate legislation is going too far. I'm a strong supporter of free speech. And the idea that you can criminalize expressing a view which we might find abhorrent, that's not acceptable role of the government. But then you have to look at it and say, well, okay, what is the effect of that view? Are they asking other people to engage in some activity which will harm other people, which will break bones? And sometimes they are. For example, from the river to the sea, the popular chant of these nutcases who go marching up and down the street, what that means is from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, there will be no Jews. How are there going to be no Jews? Only by genocide, by killing them all, or notionally expelling them perhaps, but that's realistically not what they mean. It's certainly not what Hamas means by it, and Hamas sort of fellow travellers. So when we have the governments thinking about trying to distinguish between the simple expression of an opinion and going further into something which has a significant likelihood of harming somebody else, they're getting quite muddled about it. I think the distinction is reasonably clear, although you do have to sort of work it through. But the governments, both state and federal, they really, I mean, it's difficult to ascribe a reason to it, but you'd have to think that they haven't thought deeply enough about it. They don't quite know. They don't like anti-Semitism, and so what they would like is, in theory at least, they don't like anti-Semitism. So therefore, they would like to think they can do something about something they don't like. But then, what don't they like about anti-Semitism? Is it just the expression of a viewpoint, which in a free society, no matter how abhorrent, you shouldn't be trying to mess around with that from a legislative point of view? Or are they interested in ensuring that Jewish people feel safe, they can send their children to school, their businesses are unmolested, they don't feel as if there are people out to harm them? That's a legitimate concern, and I think governments are finding it difficult, and it shouldn't be difficult, but look at who is in government in the states and in the federally, and perhaps the explanation is not so hard. They're struggling to get their heads around the difference between what they're trying to achieve.
Now, if we look at the social media of, I'm thinking of a few people. I'm thinking, Senator Ralph Babbitt, former Senator Gerard Rennick, George Christensen. See a lot of talk about Mossad, a lot of conspiracies, a lot these days about the Epstein conspiracies, bringing in Israel. So, do you think some of these conspiracy theories have gone a bit far, or is there more to it?
Absolutely. They're bonkers. But when you think about it, they are different. They are different. The content of the conspiracies is different. But if you go back in history, think about the conspiracy nonsense that has been trotted out about Jewish people. There's the old tropes about killing babies, but equally important, equally significant is the Jewish tentacles in everything. They control everything. They manipulate the banks. They just go on and on. They're absurd beyond belief. But they've been around for centuries. Goebbels didn't do anybody any favors when he picked them up and amplified them 1,000 times too. And of course, you throw enough of that sort of mud and it sticks. I don't think what we're seeing is vastly different from what those old historic anti-Jewish tropes were about. Yes, the content gets modified to suit circumstances, but it is to assume that Mossad's got its fingerprints on everything that you can't explain is not a lot different from the old stories about the Rothschilds managing the entire world economic system. They're equally ridiculous, but never die. They never go away.
Yeah, some of these guys are seeing like Mossad under the bed everywhere. Like Gerard Rennick, he thought that there was some incident in a cafe in Sydney, and he saw like Mossad is behind this, and yeah, it's getting big.
I have immense respect for Mossad, and what they did with Hezbollah in Lebanon was just phenomenal, just phenomenal. But I had 5 years in Parliament, plenty of times on the fringes of government in politics. If even a fraction of the conspiracy theories were true, it would require people far more intelligent than I ever encountered in that period. They are if you have to try and explain something, the chances of it being a cock-up rather than a conspiracy are about 99.9% to 1. Conspiracies require intelligence, coordination, and secrecy. Quiet. You've got to keep it quiet. On that one alone, governments fail enormously.
So one more question before we go to some of the audience Q&A. So we touched on very briefly the successes you had with the foreign aid, and wanted to get your thoughts on, obviously the Albanese government has restarted and doubled and even more. They're giving a lot of money now to Gaza. They're giving money to UNRWA, which is a terrible agency that goes towards funding terrorism. So what are your thoughts? Should any Australian money be going to Gaza or to these organizations?
Oh, well, I mean, I'm generally pretty unsympathetic to the foreign aid overall. There probably emergencies, tsunamis, earthquakes, and so forth like that, where Australia's foreign aid can make a material difference. But foreign aid in general, as somebody once said, it's money coming from poor people in Australia to rich people in poor countries, or more broadly, it's money taken from poor people in rich countries to rich people in poor countries. It does not mostly do very much good. So I was pretty much in favor of what Donald Trump did when he cancelled the vast majority of US aid programs. Vast amount of money being totally wasted and being funded by American taxpayers. So what I discovered in the Senate when I I went on a trip to Israel, and there I was shown some information about what was being taught in schools in the West Bank, UNRWA schools. They were basically preaching genocide, that terrorism was fine. They were rewarding terrorists. They were lionizing terrorists. It was horrific. And when I came back, with the aid of the information I got when I was in Israel, and also some more information that David Adler gave me, I was able to point to specific examples of Australian aid going to organisations on the West Bank. I don't think I ever got the examples in Gaza, but they were going to the West Bank, and I embarrassed the Foreign Affairs. They didn't know. They were just handing over money almost blindly, and it was going essentially to support terrorism, either advocacy of terrorism or overt terrorism. And it embarrassed the Department of Foreign Affairs. They did not know. David says there's some videos of it. The particular official just kept saying over and over again, "I don't know, I don't know, I don't know." That issue actually then got picked up by Shari Markson, who was at the Daily Telegraph at the time, and she did a big story on it. And as a consequence of that, Julie Bishop got involved. She was the foreign minister at the time, and a certain amount of that funding was cut off. Not all of it, and some of it has now been resumed, as was said earlier. So what we've got with Penny Wong in particular, and the Labor government more broadly perhaps, is this attitude that there should be a plague on both their houses, both the Hamas and Israel, and that Israel is rich enough to pay for its own needy, but the Palestinians are not. It's nonsense, of course, because it's bereft of values. You know, if you don't have a moral compass, you can come to a conclusion like that. But anyone with a moral compass would quickly find that ridiculous. But I don't think this current Labor government has got a moral compass. They don't understand what values they support, and so therefore they come to conclusions that paying money to Palestinians because they're losing the war, their terrorism is resulting in people getting killed, something is acceptable about that. You will recall, just within days of the October 7th, 2023 massacre by Hamas of the Israelis, our foreign minister, Penny Wong, calling for restraint. Israel hadn't even responded militarily to what had occurred, and yet here she was calling for restraint. So I think there's a shortage of moral values there. If it's not anti-Semitism, it is certainly a lack of values that most Australians would find significant.
Okay, so just before Tennille's going to take Q&A question time, but I'll just let everyone know that AJA Weekly Zoom will be on break for 3 weeks after tonight. So because we've got our upcoming Israel trip, if anyone's not joining us yet, there's still, I think, 2 more spots, including there's a spot. If a lady wants to share with another lady, there's a spot there. So everyone come on the Israel trip, speak to Tennille if you haven't booked yet. Over to Tennille for question time. So we've got a lot of people with their hands up. So everyone put your hands up, and she might go to some new people today.
Thank you very much, Robert, and thank you as well, David. It is great to see some new people in the Q&A section, some faces and names we haven't seen before. So we might start with them. Hayden, would you like to unmute, please?
Thanks very much, Tennille. I'm not completely new. I have been on previously 2 or 3 weeks ago. Very much enjoyed it, I must say. David, thank you very much for your talk. I'm always very impressed by your flagrant common sense, which is markedly absent from the public debate almost completely at the moment. The question, I put my hand up at the end of your piece on wokeism and on the left and right. And it strikes me that what unites the extreme left and the extreme right, and that includes quite a number of people now in the extreme left of the Labour Party, is that they're very angry people. And there's something about very angry people, and Carlson in the States seems to be a very angry man, is that they sort of consolidate around particular issues. And it's almost as if they feed off the hatreds of the other people. It's something they can associate with. You know, and I think we've seen that historically between the extreme left and the extreme right. You know, they seem in some ways very similar because they hate so much.
Yes, so I agree. They hate each other. I just spent 4 weeks in America. Just came back a bit over a week ago. And what struck me there was how Democrats and Republicans can't talk to each other. And I don't know that the word extreme applies to them. If they identify with their camp, their side, firmly, and I suppose not swinging voters or anything like that, but if they very much belong in the Democrat camp or they very much belong in the Republican camp, they can barely tolerate being in the same room as the other side. This is relatively new, and it's very unhealthy. It's not quite so bad here in Australia. We tend to hate both Labor and Liberal national side, and so that unites us. And their primary votes are going down. They're both barely above 30% these days, so that leaves about a third who doesn't fit into either camp, and not that many of them regard themselves as sort of bolted on, solid, never to be changed supporters of their side. So we don't see as much of it here. But you're right. I mean, it used to be that Republicans and Democrats in America and Liberal and Labor supporters here in Australia could sit in the same room, discuss something, come to a conclusion, and part, amiably. That, I'm not saying that can't occur now, but it's not anywhere near as common as it used to be. And that in a way, that's unfortunate, but I don't know what the solution is, and I'm not sure I understand the explanation even.
Thank you, David. Arn, would you like to unmute, please?
Hello, David. So my question is, Australia and Israel has a diplomatic, well, they're allies, okay? Which is why I understand why Australia should defend their allies, just like US should defend their allies. But could you explain to me, does Australia have an alliance, or does Australia have allies in Ukraine? So is Australia allies with Ukraine prior to Russia's invasion?
Well, I don't think Australia would be formally classified as an ally of Israel. I'm not aware of any commitment they have to each other. Historically, they have been very friendly. And if you go back to Bob Hawke's day, that included the Labor Party. Australia and Israel have long had very warm relationships, and that's understandable. Israel is an open economy, innovative, doing lots of good things. I mean, Australia's irrigation sector has benefited enormously from Israeli technology, and all sorts of other areas where Israel's innovative developments have benefited Australia. So that has fostered commercial connections between the two countries. But I don't think there's any formal you know, if you're attacked, we'll come to your aid, and vice versa. And the same with Ukraine. There's never been anything other than a trading relationship. In fact, in many respects, Ukraine's a competitor to Australia because it's a huge producer of wheat and other grains, which is also what Australia does. So we've been competing with Ukraine for many, many years to sell our produce, often to the same customers. Where I don't think there are many differences in the reasons why we should support both Israel and Ukraine. They're both democracies, imperfect, but then again, who are we to throw stones? Our democracy, in my opinion, is far from perfect, but they are democracies. Israel's enemies are not democracies. They are not free economies. Ukraine's enemy, Russia, is not a democracy. It's a dictatorship. It is a klepto economy, not a free economy. You can find fault with both Israel and Ukraine, but that doesn't change the basic moral assessment. I think there is a difference between being in support of both those countries and giving them material support. And, you know, the circumstances may vary between the two of them. Israel probably doesn't need any support from Australia, and I doubt very much if Australia's got anything that Israel would want anyway, whereas Ukraine is in a different category. They do need some support, and Australia's given them a little bit. But I don't think there's any question of alliances being underpinning that.
Thank you, David. Jason, would you please unmute?
Thanks, Neil. Good evening, David. Look, I appreciate your time tonight, and you've helped me to coalesce a lot of my thinking about the whole left versus right thing. So my question to you is, given that anti-Semitism is right across the spectrum, would it be a better use or a better model to think about the horseshoe theory? What are your thoughts on that?
Just explain what you're thinking there is.
The horseshoe theory, if you've heard of it, is that extreme left and extreme right are basically the same thing in terms of their approaches and their desired outcomes. They just say it in different ways. And the more moderate ends of the spectrum tend to be along the horseshoe.
Yeah, so I'm not sure that I subscribe to that. I mean, there is a big difference between the right and the, well, it depends how you define the right. We all understand what the left means. It's socialism, communism, or variants around that. Some say social democracy. So we understand that to mean the left. What do we mean on the right? We certainly don't mean fascism because it was socialist by nature. Do we mean free market capitalism? Do we mean what Milei is doing in Argentina, where he's basically deregulating the economy, sacking public servants, letting the dogs of capitalism loose? Do we regard that as right wing? Legitimately, yeah, we should. But I think that where you're thinking is in terms of their tactics rather than their beliefs. They don't have any tolerance for each other, and they don't have any tolerance for dissent. So on the far left, of course, the cancel culture is notorious. We've got Antifa in America attempting to burn down buildings and shoot the anti-immigration authorities. Violent resistance to those who they oppose politically is typical of the far left. On the far right, we haven't seen that quite so much, but we certainly do see an intolerance and an unwillingness to engage. And to some extent, a cancel culture is popping up. So there are people who will argue that somebody with unacceptable left-wing views shouldn't be heard. They should be cancelled. And deplatformed. So there are characteristics of, if you want to call them far right and the far left, which is more recognizable in terms of the way they behave. But I don't think there's much, unless you include Nazism on the far right, which I think is a variant of socialism anyway, and so do most people. I don't think you find they share their views very closely.
Thank you. Mary, would you please unmute?
I was wondering what your thoughts are about the UK and what they're doing. I see in the news there was just someone arrested for blasphemy, and it's a big deal. So how close are we to aligning with what they're doing?
Yeah. All right. I have so far avoided jumping into this issue of the influence of Muslims on our culture. It's hard to avoid that, though, when you look at the UK. Why are they almost criminalising blasphemy? Why are they arresting people for social media posts? It's because this claim that Islamophobia is an evil which must be stamped out. Again, it's a little bit like, well, it is very much like, do you criminalise anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic views? Do you criminalise Islamophobia? If you're a free speech person, as I am, the answer is no, you don't. You don't criminalise either. England, or Britain, is losing that argument in many respects. They are, and not only that, they're showing inconsistent values. So they are showing increasing willingness to criminalise negative views, what they will characterise as harmful, hurtful speech against the Muslims or the Muslim religion or Muslim practices, and yet they show no interest in doing the same for any other religion, Christianity or Jewishness in particular. That's not an issue that so far we've seen in Australia, other than some street demonstrations in which the pro-Hamas crowd seem to have been policed to a different standard than the pro-Israel standard. We've only seen a couple of examples of that, and I'm not sure that it's a consistent issue. It is a consistent issue in Britain. We're seeing what they're now calling two-tier policing. So one standard for one group and a different standard for another group. It's a very worrying thing. I don't know where it's going to end, because I think there's going to be a massive backlash by British voters. And in many respects, the Reform Party is showing early signs of that. I'm not sure where it's going to end, or if it was going to end. But I wouldn't be at all surprised if there is quite a political revolt against what's going on in the UK. Quite a thing. America has the First Amendment, the Free Speech Amendment, so it's less of an issue there. But England, and for that matter Australia, don't have any constitutional entrenched barriers to infringing on free speech, and what we're seeing in England reflects that.
Thank you, David. I was sent a question earlier in the night, and I'll read that out to you if that's okay. So this is from Jim. Do you think that federal public servants in Canberra have become more partisan and overtly left-wing, or is it just a naive perception? They seem to be more extreme and have less integrity now.
Well, elections in the ACT are not a very happy hunting ground for the Liberals, the Conservative side of politics, the Liberals or the Nationals. Overwhelmingly support Labor or the Greens or somebody who's painted with the same colours like Pocock. So very clearly within the ACT, within Canberra, there is a strong left-wing base. It's the same in Washington, DC, as a matter of fact. The Republicans can't take a trick in Washington, DC. It's all Democrats, and mostly left-wing Democrats to that, as well as that. The question really is that a change? Not necessarily. It's reasonably easy to understand. The bulk of the people living in Canberra depend on the public purse. They don't want that public purse to be dried up. So people like me, who would like to reduce taxes and make quite a lot of those public servants go and get jobs in the private sector, we're anathema to them. The mere fact that the Liberals and the Nationals would be in nodding agreement with somebody like me, that's enough for them to not get any votes as well. They see their careers in terms of more public servants, more people to supervise, bigger budgets, greater empires. Ever since Canberra was established, that has been the case. It's hard to know whether it's any more overt than it ever was, but it has always been a factor. Now, does that influence the way they behave, the way they act? The second part of the question. Yeah, they might, and we sometimes see examples of that. But mostly, with a few exceptions, mostly the senior people in the government departments are professionals, irrespective of their personal political views. And mostly, if they are professionals, they will give solid advice to the government, and they'll implement government policy. And government policy is not all developed by the public servants. There are outside sources as well. And a decent minister might take advice from a left-wing public servant, but then would also seek advice from other people. Of industrial relations, you don't get much right-wing advice, but on other things, banking regulation, superannuation regulation, those sorts of things, they'll go off and consult with the industry, notwithstanding what public servants say. So I don't know whether it's any worse than it was, but it's always been a factor.
Thank you, David. We are just about out of time for tonight. So before we wrap up, we'd like to ask you, following politics, what are you up to? If people want to continue to engage with you to follow your journey, what are the steps they can take?
Well, I'm retired from politics, and I just recently sold the last of my business. So I'm actually now retired from the working world. I'm 73 now, and that's probably old enough to do that. I'm on Twitter and I'm on Facebook, or Twitter X. I'm on Twitter and on Facebook and on X. I write a lot. I'm the editor of Liberty Itch, which is a newsletter, a libertarian newsletter. If you look up libertyitch.com or something, com or org or something, you'll find it. You can subscribe. There's free subscription. So I am, I suppose, continuing the libertarian message as much as I can, but active involvement in politics is in the past now.
Thank you, David. I have put Liberty Itch in the chat. And again, if you'd like to follow David on X or Facebook to hear some more of his opinions, I just looked at that Liberty Itch website. It's very easy to sign up, so please have a look at that. This has been recorded, so please share these messages with your friends and family. It'll be available on our YouTube channel as well as our Facebook page. If you're not signed up to AJA, please sign up. Please consider supporting, becoming a member, donating to us. Again, I did see someone when they came on, we sell hostage pins, we sell scarves. We have an amazing shop on our website. So please have a look at our shop and check that out as well. But finally, David, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you on this evening. Thank you very much for joining us. It's always a pleasure. We would love to have you again, of course. So please keep in touch, and thank you very much, David.
Thank you very
Good
much.
evening, everybody.